This is episode 375 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Dan Falk, science journalist and author of The Science of Shakespeare. Another great way to explore the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
While Shakespeare's plays are filled with references to ale and sack, wine played a central role in both the economy and social customs of Renaissance England. In this episode, we're uncorking the history of winemaking in Shakespeare's lifetime, looking at what kinds of grapes were grown, how wine was stored and served, and why a cold snap in the 1500s forever changed England's vineyards. Our guest, winemaker and historian Stephen Franzoi, joins us today to explore the world of Elizabethan viticulture and what Shakespeare himself might have been sipping. Stephen Franzoi is a winemaker and historian with a passion for uncovering the roots of Renaissance viticulture. With deep knowledge of both historical wine practices and modern winemaking techniques, Stephen brings a unique perspective to the table, one that bridges the gap between the vineyard and the archives. Today, he's here to help us explore the wines of Shakespeare's England, how they were made, where they came from, and what they reveal about early modern life. Before we dive into our conversation today, a quick note that, like Shakespeare himself, this podcast is supported by our patrons. If you're logged in on the show notes page for this episode, patrons can find bonus material that brings today's conversation to life, including images of Renaissance winemaking tools, maps of historical wine trade routes, and references to the grape varieties and vintages you can explore while you listen to the show. Find all these extras at cassidycash.com/episode 375. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Stephen. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you, Cassidy. I'm glad to be here.
Were there wineries in England for Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, prior to Shakespeare's birth, England was well known for its vineyards, its wineries, and its wines. Through much of the Middle Ages, England was a leader in grape growing and winemaking, not only because that England was a worldwide power, but also because of the medieval warm period that occurred in the North Atlantic region during that time. And that was advantageous for grape growing and for winemaking. At the end of the 11th century, there were about 50 vineyards in the southern part of England, and most of them were associated with the church in monasteries, and they produced wine. And these vineyards prospered for more than 300 years. And it made England an important winemaking country in Europe. But then, unfortunately, in the mid-1500s, England and that area entered into the Little Ice Age. And that's where temperatures dropped 1 to 2 degrees in England. And that was enough of a drop that it pretty much decimated the vineyards in southern England. So it was very difficult to grow quality grapes. They were still growing grapes, but they were not nearly the quality they were for the previous 300 years. And with this drop in temperature, it was difficult for wines and the wineries in Shakespeare's time to produce good quality grapes.
What kind of wine grapes were the ones that were sought after? You're mentioning they weren't as good quality, but what kind of grapes were they?
Well, they were often, the Romans brought over hundreds of years before, they brought over French vinifera grapes and Greek grapevines to England, and they planted those. Some of those took hold, and they tend to be white French vinifera grapes like Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. So those were the ones, but also the type of wines that were very sought after by the English during that time were the wines from France, from Spain, and from Greece.
I'm surprised that they would have reached to Spain for grapes, especially during the Elizabethan period, because, everything Spanish was a little tense at this time. So,
well, that's true. And there was also conflict with France. And so the good thing for the English was that in Bordeaux, France, which was very high quality wines that were being produced there, most of the vineyards were controlled by English overlords. And so they were able to import a lot of the wines from that region and also from Provence. But that was also interrupted by wars and tensions between the countries. And so even though England had a good import business during that time, they often couldn't get the wines from Spain and from France because of the wars that were going on.
when we say wines, I would like to clarify what kind of wine. I mean, I think my favorite wine has to be Chateauneuf du Pape. That's my favorite one to drink. But I wonder if Shakespeare would have had that. Or you've mentioned wines from Bordeaux. Does that mean he was drinking Bordeaux and Chardonnay? Or what? If we're recreating Shakespeare's table and he was going to have a nice glass of wine, what would be the most popular one to have on his table?
Well, I think, Chateauneuf du Pape would definitely be a very high quality wine that I'm sure Shakespeare would have valued, and the wines from Bordeaux as well, Cabernet and Merlot. So that is true, but they were very expensive, and Shakespeare wasn't extremely rich during his lifetime, even though he did buy quite a bit of land. Those type of very high quality wines were meant for the upper classes of England. Now, what he probably drank were some white wines. From Greece, there was a white wine that was sweet. It was called Malmsey, and it was very popular in England in the 16th century. And then there was also a sweet wine that came from the Canary Islands, and that was called Canary. And then a wine that sometimes isn't thought of as a wine, but with my winemaking group, we judge wines for the Wisconsin State Fair. So it's included as a wine, and so I'll call it a wine, but it's mead. It was wine made from honey. Technically, wine is usually thought of as made from grapes, but England had a lot of honey that they produced. And so mead was also a very popular drink during that time. So those were probably the three white sweet wines that Shakespeare probably drank during those times.
We're familiar with Malmsey, and the word mead does come up in Shakespeare's plays, but he actually uses it to talk about a meadow. I couldn't find any references to mead, the drink, in his play, but he does talk about Malmsey, and it's a famous scene from Shakespeare's plays. He talks about a butt of Malmsey in Richard III when the character, George, Duke of Clarence, gets murdered by being drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. It's a
right.
It's a huge, amazing scene for Shakespeare. Yeah. But I don't think any of us can call to mind immediately what we know that it's a liquid. But for first time people seeing that play, they probably don't know what is actually in the barrel that he's talking about there. So that helps us know that it's a sweet white wine from Greece. So it's very helpful.
Yeah.
So, but that brings us to the question of how was wine made in the 16th century? I know we think of people stamping wine with their feet as being an old way to produce wine, but is that the way it was done for Shakespeare's lifetime?
Yes, it was made in large barrels. They would take the grapes, they would harvest the grapes, they'd put them into large barrels, and then people would climb in and with their bare feet would stomp them. Then the natural yeast on the grapes started the fermentation. Winemakers during Shakespeare's time didn't understand why the grape juice was turned into what the process was. They incorrectly thought it was a chemical process, but in fact, we know now that it's an organic process. It's that you have these live yeast that are on the grapes that then consume the sugars in the juice, and the yeast literally poop out carbon dioxide and alcohol that makes the wine. So that's what they did, but they didn't have their winemaking techniques were not very good then. Now, in Europe, in the southern part of Europe at this time, some winemakers began putting sulfite into their wines. That's very good for preserving the wines, but I don't think that English winemakers were doing that during Shakespeare's time yet. It hadn't yet transferred over. So the wine was best when it was done fermenting and it had the carbon dioxide fizz still in the wine, which was also a good preservative for the wine for a period of time. The wine would be young and fruity, and that was when it was the best tasting and probably was sold at the highest price. And because they didn't top, they would then put the wine into barrels and then draw from the barrels throughout the year. But what they didn't understand was that as they took wine from the barrels, there would be this air at the top inside the barrels, and that allowed oxygen in to oxygenate the wine, which is never good. It would cause white wines and the red wines to become brown and sour tasting. So as very quickly the wines would become not undrinkable, because the English needed to drink the wine and mix it with water so that they could actually, hydrate themselves. It was a very short-lived kind of wine for them.
We have a joke in our house that my husband says that he can make any kind of food sound disgusting. And I cannot let him know that wine and the fermentation process is actually yeast poop, or that'll just be what he calls it from now on.
If your readers or your listeners would like to get an idea of the kind of wine that Shakespeare and others were drinking during this time, but more likely the lower classes, what you could do is buy a cheap bottle of white wine like a Chardonnay, and then pour a glass. So there's maybe about 6 ounces at the top of the bottle. Then put a little bit of vinegar in it, and then stick it out in your garage during the summertime with the cork out of it, and let it sit there for a month or two. And then also add a little bit of salt to the water, because they would add salt or some other spices and some honey to make it more drinkable, and then bring it in and then taste it. And that's probably going to be fairly much like the kind of wine that the lower classes in England were drinking during that time. And they would drink it in the morning when they got up for breakfast, and they would mix it with their water. They would drink it throughout the day. They would put it in animal skins, that they would carry with them, bladders, throughout the day. And that would have this very unpleasant taste to it. So people in England and throughout Europe were drinking alcoholic beverages mixed with water, because the water often had a lot of bacteria that made them sick. So the good thing about the wine was that it would kill the bacteria. It also made them somewhat intoxicated throughout the day, even children.
I want to ask you to explain the difference here. I'm not hugely familiar with the process of wine, but I know that red wines, it's often suggested that you decant them because you want to add the oxygenation to the wine when you're pouring it out to drink it. Why was the barrels being left with a hole at the top, not just a giant decanter? Why does that version of adding oxygen ruin the wine, but you're suggested to decant red wine to bring out the flavor today? What's the difference there?
For red wines, especially ones that are high in what we call tannins, that's that when you drink a wine and it makes your mouth and your tongue feel like sandpaper almost. It's very, it has a really rough, astringent kind of taste to it. Those are tannins, and tannins actually help preserve the wine. And so most red wines will age for a longer period of time than the white wines, because for white wines, you crush the grapes and then press them off their skins almost immediately. And so there's very little tannins in the white wines. But in red wines, what you do is you crush the grapes and then you ferment them on their skins for a week to 2 weeks or longer. And then you press them, the newly fermented wine, you press it off the skins, and it's got a lot of the tannins in the red wine. So when you open a bottle of red wine that is, maybe say 5 to 10 years old, often you will pour it into a decanter and to let it sit and aerate for an hour or two to soften the wines a little bit more, to allow the tannins to adjust and to soften a bit. So that's what you do with red wines. But the winemakers were doing, and the people in the taverns were doing, they had these oak barrels. And my grandfather also was from northern Italy. And so when I was younger, he had huge barrels, oak barrels, and he had made wine in his basement. And he did the same thing. He would pull wine from the barrels with a hose and then put it into a bottle and then bring it upstairs for dinner for the family. But as he did that, that would leave an air pocket in the oak barrel, even when you put the bung on the top of it. And that's when oxygen was then infusing into the wine. And it's not a good thing for wine to receive oxygen. For aerating the wine just before you drink it, the red wine, okay, that's okay for about an hour. And for red wines during the fermentation process, a little bit of oxygen while it's fermenting, and there's a lot of preservatives in there with the carbon dioxide, that's also fine. But for wines, once it's fermented and there's no more fermentation going on, then you want to keep oxygen away, especially for the white wines, but also for the red wines.
Well, if Shakespeare's England didn't have this understanding of the relationship between wine storage and oxygen and how to protect all of that, then what was the process for storing wine? We can tell from Shakespeare's play that at least Malmsey was kept in a barrel at some point, but what was the standard process for storing wine, and what were the options, I guess, for where you're going to put it?
Yeah, well, wine bottles weren't really very common during Shakespeare's time, but around I think it was 1633, an Englishman perfected a heavier weighted wine bottle that was then used for champagne in France, for making champagne. Most of the time, the wine that Shakespeare would be drinking, some of it would be in bottles, but most of it would be in kegs and in oak barrels. And you'd simply draw it out of those barrels, maybe with a spigot on the side. And that's how you would, in a tavern, that's what you'd get. You'd maybe get your mug filled up with wine. And the thing is, though, wine was pretty expensive. It was 12 times more expensive in a tavern than beer was, and also mead. So it was expensive and didn't taste that good.
Would they have ever drank wine from a wine glass? Shakespeare moved in some pretty high circles. So I like to think he was at some aristocratic tables at various times where he would have had the opportunity to drink some of these higher class wines. And I wonder if it would have been served in a glass.
Yes, it would have been served in a glass. Could have been a clear glass, or it could have been a clay glass, a ceramic glass. And it would have been most likely then from France or Spain or Greece, probably from the Bordeaux area, from Provence, or from Burgundy. And it would have been good wine, and it could have been red or white, because Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Cheval Blanc, all of those are grown and produced, and wine made from them in France, but also other countries as well.
Well, this Renaissance period that Shakespeare is living in is known for being a huge period of change. As you've alluded to earlier, even the winemaking, it moved or experienced this huge shift from being something that was really popular in England to something that was really struggling by the time Shakespeare was alive, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's decision making. It was literally the weather that was thwarting them there. But during this time of change, we see a lot of change to viticulture and winemaking that was going on. So tell us about what the major changes were in the process of winemaking, as well as what were some things that they improved during the 16th and 17th century.
Well, one of the things, as I mentioned, was that they began to not just keep the wine in, like 60-gallon oak barrels and allowed it to slowly become oxygenated as they took, small portions of wine out of it. But what they began to do is they began to produce bottles, glass bottles, that they would then put the wine in from the barrels and then put corks into the top of the bottles to secure them. So now you had a much smaller vessel to store the wine, and there was very little oxygenation that occurred with the cork in there. So that was a big improvement. And as I mentioned, sulfite was starting to be used in certain parts of Europe, but it hadn't yet probably reached England, but shortly after that, it started to be used worldwide in Europe, and that greatly improved. Sulfur is it's still used in winemaking today, and you'll find it in all commercial wines, almost all commercial wines, except for the ones that are considered organic. But sulfur in very small amounts is something that is a preservative and is very good for aging a wine for years. So that's another thing they were doing. Well, one thing that was happening also is they were, developing champagne, and the carbon dioxide in the champagne is also a preservative. So that also improved quality of wine for a longer period of time.
So would Shakespeare, when you say so Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616. In his lifetime, had they perfected a champagne, would that have come to England and been something Shakespeare would have known about or seen?
Probably not. No,
okay.
Probably not. And the improved wine bottles were made in 1633, but there were wine bottles and there were corks that were being used during his time.
So this would have been considered new winemaking technology for his lifetime, and probably not something, if he saw it at all, it would have hit the end of his life, because it sounds like he missed these innovations by about 15 years.
Right. And his father actually was a person who was checked on the quality of beer in Stratford. And so I would suspect that Shakespeare probably drank a good deal of beer and mead.
That's right. Yes. John Shakespeare worked as an ale taster for the town of Stratford-upon-Avon. And yeah, I would think that he was probably really familiar with the process, I would expect. Now, tell us about different labels, though. You're talking about them being imported to Shakespeare's lifetime from France and Spain and Greece, and these were popular countries to import from. But do we know about who it was that they were being bought from? Was there a particular winery or a label that was like, oh, if you get wine from these people, then it's the best that you can get? Was there that kind of hierarchy among quality of wines during this time period?
Yeah, there were definitely wineries that were known as being very high quality wines in France. I'm not so certain about Greece or Spain, but certainly in France, in Bordeaux and in Burgundy and in Provence, there were certain wineries that were, had been there for centuries and were known as being very good winemakers. So those would have been highly prized. I can't tell you off the top of my head which ones those were in the early part of this, the 17th century, though.
I use ChatGPT way too much, but in this instance, it's very, very helpful because I asked it to give me a list of notable wine estates from 16th and 17th century France. Yeah. And it's coming back saying that Chateau Haut-Brion was founded in 1525 and referenced in English records by 1660. Samuel Pepys, who was writing after Shakespeare, but about things that would have existed in Shakespeare's lifetime, mentions Haut-Brion in his 1663 diary, which is apparently one of the earliest recorded mentions of a wine estate by name. It also mentions, Chinon, Sancerre, and Saumur were popular at the French court during the Renaissance under Francois I. So anyway, those are... Yeah.
In terms of like before we talked about English wines and English grapes, there's really very little documentation about what kind of grapes were grown in England during the warm period. And that's probably because it was in monasteries and those records probably didn't survive over the centuries. So yeah, it's difficult to know what grapes were grown in England. And that's probably also true in terms of when did the trade start to go, come from France too and other countries to England?
Yeah, I would think there's got to be a relationship between it starting out in a monastery. I doubt the monastery was probably using whatever it could get, and it wasn't really picky about the kind of grapes that it was using. I would expect, because I associate the monastery with a certain level of poverty. Yeah.
the wines that the monastery would be making would be the wines that were in their vineyards, so they
So just
weren't
whatever they could grow there. Yeah.
right. Yeah, they weren't importing anything from France, no grapes. It was always, and when the importation came, it was always just the finished wines.
Now, we've talked about it starting out in a monastery, and we've also talked about the different levels of wine happening for the different classes in England. But tell us about the social customs surrounding wine. You've identified that in a tavern, it would have been much more expensive to order wine than to have a mug of beer or ale. But was wine used in churches for communion, the way that we associate wine with churches today? And was it a social drink? I mean, if you had a party, would you have had wine, or was it expected in both instances?
It definitely was used in religious ceremonies and in communion. It would have been used, like I said earlier, by the monks and the nuns and everybody else. It would have been mixed with water throughout the day to drink it so that they wouldn't get sick. And in terms of parties, it would be probably there, but most likely, in big parties, it probably would be more so the beer and the cider that would be available because it was a lot cheaper. But maybe around this time of the year, they might be able to get the wine fairly cheap, not as expensive as in the fall because it was pretty sour tasting then. It would be it's a social drink, but it's also a drink that people ingested for every single meal and throughout the day while they were working.
Would it have functioned as a gift? Like if you had a really high value wine, would it have ever been given as a gift to anyone?
Probably for the upper classes. For the peasants, might have been given as a gift, but it would have been probably in a animal skin, not in a bottle, because they couldn't afford bottles. They couldn't afford those.
Well, we've only touched the surface of the wine history related to William Shakespeare, and there's a lot more to uncover and explore. Stephen, you have explored this area of history more than most, so we're excited to ask you about your favorite resources you can recommend that we start with if we're new to this kind of history and we want to learn more.
Well, there's one book that I think is useful, and that's Paul Lucas's book. It's called Inventing Wine, A New History of the World's Most Ancient Pleasures. It's from W. Norton. It was published in 2012, and it goes through the history of winemaking with a big focus on Europe. So that would be one. If your listeners are interested in making wine themselves, there's a good book by Daniel Pambianchi, published in 2021 called Modern Home Winemaking, A Guide to Making Consistently Great Wines. That's published out of Montreal. And then your listeners could also go to the Wisconsin Vintners Association website, which I'm a member and a past on the board of directors there. And I was the editor of the Vintners Press for many years. And we have some sample articles for the Vintners Press. If a person wanted to join our club, it costs $25 for two people for a year. And you'd get access to well over 100 winemaking articles that I've written and other people have written over the past 30 years. And a lot of some of the articles I've written have been about the history of winemaking and covering from ancient times to contemporary times. So those are three sources I think would be valuable.
These are really great resources. We will link to these in the show notes for today's episode. And I'll second the Wisconsin Vintners Association, who were so gracious to help connect me with Stephen for today's conversation. So definitely go check them out. And thank you to the Wisconsin Vintners Association for helping us put this together. Now, Stephen, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life. What's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those. And apparently on the original Desert Island Disc show, which this question was inspired by, you were also offered a luxury item. So you may select a luxury item to have available on your island stay as well.
A luxury item. Well, it's
as if picking a book wasn't a hard enough question. We threw you in a curveball there too.
Okay, my career has been in psychology, and I study the self-concept and self-awareness and seeking self-knowledge. And that's what I've done research on. And now that I'm mostly retired, I would probably say that the book that I would bring would be the I Ching, which is the book of changes. It's a Chinese book that in which you throw yarrow stocks or coins, and those coins or the yarrow stocks, the way they fall corresponds to certain numbers that you look up in the I Ching, and then it gives you guidance in your life. And so I've done that since I was an undergraduate student in university in the 1970s. And I think the way that I look at it is that it's something that will maybe perhaps allow me to project onto these hexagrams that I'm reading from the I Ching certain unconscious thoughts and feelings I might have that I'm not quite aware of, and make them more conscious for me. So I think I would take the I Ching along with me.
I think that sounds like a fascinating selection. I don't think I've ever had anyone suggest that. And after the interview, I'm going to get you to spell that for me so we can list it in the show notes today in case you're also curious. So, Stephen, what's next for you? What are you now that you're excited about?
Even though I'm retired as a professor at Marquette University, I still have textbooks that I revise every 4 years to keep up with the research that's been published during that time. So I just finished publishing the 9th edition of my social psychology textbook, but I'm working on the 8th edition of my introductory psychology textbook. So I'm in the copy editing stages right now, and it keeps my mind sharp and keeps me humble about what I don't know still about life. So I think that's one of the exciting things that I'm doing right now. That, and plus doing traveling and making wine myself, and just spending time with people that I enjoy spending time with.
It sounds like a great way to spend your time. Definitely. I'm jealous to be able to travel and make wine. And Stephen just returned from visiting France and getting to see some of the winemaking that's going on there, which is just a wonderful time to get to do. Stephen, we thank you so much for being here and helping us take a look into the history of winemaking for Shakespeare's lifetime and understand what he would have been drinking and how it was made and the differences between winemaking then and today. That was just really an exciting trip into history. Thank you for being here to share it with us.
Thanks for having me, Cassidy.
That's it for today's exploration into the wines of Shakespeare's world. A warm thank you to Stephen for sharing all of this history and expertise on what vintages the bard might have known and how they were made. To learn more about Stephen and explore the books and resources he recommends for you, visit the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 375. While you're there, you'll also find bonus content for patrons, including images of 16th century winemaking equipment, fermentation practices, and maps of European wine trade routes. And if you're part of our Experience Shakespeare program on Patreon, this week's hands-on activity kit invites you to try your hand at Elizabethan spiced wine, blending honey, herbs, and warming spices into a historical recipe you can sip and share. This episode was researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your barrels be full, your tannins well-aged, and your cup or your flagon be always full. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.